The European system will falter for any number of reasons. The first rationale is both the most obvious and the least manageable. Europe's baby bust started before Asia's, with the Europeans passing the point of demographic no return even before the new millennium. Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Austria will all age into mass retirement in the first half of the 2020s, while nearly every country in a Central European line from Estonia to Bulgaria is aging even faster and will age out in the second half. Even worse, demographics alone ensure that Europe as we know it will collapse on a similar time schedule. When the Central European states joined the EU in the 2000s, they succeeded in convincing the Western Europeans to open their labor markets. Some 1/4 to 1/3 of the young worker population of the Central European region decamped for better personal economic prospects to the West. Western Europe's demographic figures are far worse than they actually appear. Whether it's because Central Europeans return home when the going gets tough, which robs Western Europe of its workforce, or because more Central Europeans head to Western Europe when the going gets tough because those are the only jobs left, the labor balance that has enabled European economic functionality since 2008 is about to evaporate. The demographic problem haunts in a second way. Europe has aged to the point that it cannot absorb its own products. Europe must maintain a high level of exports to maintain its system. The top destination is the United States, a country that is turning ever inward. The United States is also exploring a similarly broad spectrum trade deal with the United Kingdom. As any future trade peace with the EU will soon require London's sign-off, no one in continental Europe should count on easy rectification. The European products that do not go to the United States instead travel to the far side of the planet, Northeast Asia. Even if, against all odds, the Northeast Asian system, as well as Northeast Asian demand for European products, survives, the Americans will no longer be guaranteeing freedom of the seas for civilian maritime shipping. The route from Shanghai to Hamburg is a breezy 12,000 nautical miles. At the zippy 17 miles per hour that modern container ships typically sail at, that's a cool 35-day trip. The fastest any commercial cargo vessel can sail is 25 knots. That's still 3 full weeks, a lot of time to spend sailing through waters infested with pirates, privateers, hostile navies, or some combination of the three. Perhaps even worse, the part of Europe that maintains the most robust trade relationship with the Chinese is Germany. German product sales to China skew very heavily in the direction of machinery used to make other products for export. Even if, against all odds, Germany and China can maintain a trade relationship in a world where they lack the strategic reach to interact directly, Chinese exports will not be nearly as needed, undermining the base rationale for any sort of German-Chinese interaction. The same broad strategic issues that face the Asians also face the Europeans, although those particular problems are of less or more concern depending upon location and perspective. Most European countries started industrializing in the 1800s, with even the laggards, largely the former Soviet satellite states, beginning at the latest in the 1950s. That means most mines in Europe have been tapped out for at least a few decades. The Europeans, having been industrialized for at minimum a couple of generations, may not consume as many materials as the Asians, but they produce even fewer. The Chinese might import the vast majority of the materials they need, but typically, the Europeans must import them all. Most of the industrial commodities required for modern life come from locations far closer to Europe than East Asia, such as the Western Hemisphere and Africa. Several European countries, France and the United Kingdom come to mind, but so too do Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and Denmark, have sufficient naval capacity to protect occasional shipping to and from the locations in question. Just as good, most sailings from these regions to Europe are unlikely to pass through any particularly contested waters. As to Western Hemispheric sourcing, the Americans are certain to put the kibosh on any sort of piracy or privateering in their hemisphere, and European commerce is unlikely to be barred so long as it remains unmilitarized. The trick will come from those European countries farther removed from the continent's far west, who lack both access and naval forces. They must source materials from a different, close location: Russia. Germany cannot maintain its position as a wealthy and free nation without the Americans. But Germany also cannot maintain its position as a modern, industrialized nation without Russia. The story of all things German and Russian is about alternating chapters of begrudging cooperation and incisive conflict. As searing as that is for the Germans and Russians, it is far worse for the peoples between them, countries essential to Germany's manufacturing supply chains. The Ukraine war is already forcing some tough questions upon all involved. Even all this assumes nothing goes wrong within Europe. Europe suffers from one of those weird geographies where just enough of it is flat and well-rivered and easy to walk across that portions of the continent are convinced that they can and should lead a major consolidated power, while there are just enough bits that are peninsular or mountainous or island to play host to dissident powers that will always dash such dreams. It's only during the order that global peace and wealth smothered the age-old contest between the two visions. Despite 75 years of healing and growth and safety and security and modernization and freedom and democracy, much internal angst and grievance remains. Brexit, occurring at the very height of globalization, is a case in point. With the American withdrawal, that smothering ends. The Germanocentric system cannot maintain its current position, much less grow, and no one in the world has a strategic interest in bailing it out. The challenge for Central Europe will be to keep the Germans from acting like a normal country. The last 7 times Germany did, things got historical. Europe's subsidiary trade networks look more favorable than the Germanocentric system. The Sweden-centric system might be able to hold together. Northern Europe's supply chains are less exposed to potential threats, its energy supplies are more local, and its demographics are less aged and slower aging, suggesting a better match between supply and demand that would limit the need for extra regional imports and exports in the first place. In the North Sea, the Scandinavians even have sufficient oil and natural gas to meet nearly all their demand. All they need to do is somehow source the various industrial inputs they need from a continent away. They have 2 options. The first is to partner with the French system, at least in part. In addition to France boasting sufficient domestic consumption to absorb its own production, it also has sufficient geographic insulation and positioning to reach the needed inputs. Add in a competent expeditionary military and a nearly galactic volume of self-regard, and France can reasonably go its own way. We are going to have 9 to 15% inflation annually for a minimum of 5 years. Now, before you have a stroke and call your broker, deep breath. If we do this, if we pull it off, we will have supply chains that are at home, that employ people on this continent, that serve people on this continent. The supply chains will be simpler, with fewer steps, that are cleaner, you lose less energy, are more highly skilled, are more efficient, and will be largely immune to international shocks. And we will exit that 5-year transition period with the strongest economy that Mexico, Canada, and the United States have ever seen. And we will have 5 years of the fastest growth in the history of all 3 countries. Or we can still have that inflation and after 5 years not have stuff, which means we have more inflation. From my point of view, this is a really easy call. But I'm not the decision maker. That would be you. No pressure. All right. I think we're past that. Politically, I think the United States is mostly done. And if you look at who we've elected since 1989, we've gone with progressively more populist presidents all the way up until Biden. But the economic issue, I don't think is sustainable anymore anyway. It was one thing when we did this in 1945, because everyone else in the world was basically wrecked, and our economy was bigger than the rest of the world put together. That's not the world we're in.
We've been indirectly subsidizing most of the world for 75 years now. And that has allowed countries who don't have the geography or the access to raw materials or the access to markets to become significant. And the top of that list, of course, is China. So if we could do a share and turn back some time and go back to 2001, there was a moment under George W. Bush when we were trying to basically, it's going to sound a little jaded, but beat Russia and China into shape and say, you know, the Cold War system is over. We're entering a fundamentally new era. We need to renegotiate the terms of globalization. And if you do that, great, we're all in this together. And if you don't, we will bury you. And then 9/11 happened. And we got a little distracted for 20 years. And in that time, we maintained enough of the structures of globalization that all these places that had poor geographies kept growing. And now collectively, they're twice our size. We can't subsidize things of that size. Unless, of course, we want to spend all of our national blood and treasure making sure that China is the unassailable superpower. I don't think that's going to fly. No, because you remember ours, right? Ours are pretty good. I mean, we're still aging and we still have these distortions when we go from the big boomers to the small Xers to the big millennials to the small Zers. But these are problems we can manage over time. In addition, we are partnered with Mexico, which has the healthiest demography, not just in the rich world, but in the advanced developing world as well, better than India, better than Indonesia or Turkey. And so if there were two countries that were better positioned to do well, it would be those two. And the fact that they're already linked together in a trade deal. I mean, there are a lot of things about Donald Trump I was not a fan of. NAFTA 2 was freaking brilliant, and it's done. It's embedded into the system. And this political sniping that we see around the world in our own country doesn't really apply to NAFTA. I mean, Biden and the Mexican president, AMLO, they loathe each other personally, professionally, ideologically, and they just got done with the Three Amigos Summit. It was the most successful summit we have had with NAFTA since 2006. So this is a relationship that works, and no one else has something like that. So will I mourn Europe when it's gone? Yeah, because that's less than 20 years away. But time isn't gonna stop. And courtesy of none other than Donald Trump, we now have a multiracial future of cooperation. And that just feels weird. But that's where we are. Yeah, I mean, France will last longer. France has a demography that's a lot more like ours. So, you know, you can put off going to Paris for a few years, it'll still be there. But if you're gonna go to Germany, honestly, you are running out of time. As long as you think of oil and gas as a source of income as opposed to a source of electricity, it's a negative because you're kind of gonna get that whole, the Dutch disease, where you're over-dependent on one specific thing that's cyclical in its demand. But if you use it to do other things, well, holy crap, there's not a whole lot of sectors that you couldn't go into. The biggest problem that you guys have is you just don't have another population center that's near you. And that makes it really difficult for you to synergize and achieve economies of scale. And that's why I think you should go into processing, because you have something here that is bottled up. And so for you, and mostly only for you, it's at a cost structure that no one else can match. You should use that. I'm not saying you shouldn't try, but you're going to be a very small minnow in a pond that is not close to you. And that's a very risky proposition. So will there be niche things that you can expand into? Sure, but I don't think you're going to be able to do it at scale. But if you build out the things that allow manufacturers to function, you will be absolutely indispensable. And it's far better for you to own Texas than the other way around. We're going to bitch and we're going to moan, but we're going to be fine. Let me go through this one group at a time. Okay, baby boomers, they're retiring, but they are going to have the voting capacity to make sure that no one takes away their benefits for at least another 15 years. Damn it. Gen X, small generation, we're now the capital providers. One of the reasons that the baby boomers have been a little bit stressed out and very willing to vote themselves benefits is their money has been out competing, it's been oversupplied. The rate of return has been really low. That's going to reverse with Gen X. So Gen Xers that are able to invest are probably going to see the biggest returns in financial history for the next 15 years. It will be a fight to make sure that the government doesn't take it, and the boomers will try. Don't let them. Millennials, a little late to the start, but they're now having kids in numbers. They are literally the future. And the millennials they've got a lot of negative connotations, and I could talk for an hour on that. Let's focus on the positive. They're congenial, they're cooperative, they're collaborative, they're good at the touchy-feely skills, they're great managers. They are the people who will not just solve problems, but manage everything, and they've got the personal characteristics necessary to do that at scale. And they're consumers. Then you've got Gen Z, the new kids. Gen Z were not millennials. So, the millennials were raised by the boomers, and they were told that they were special, and we don't keep track of the score at the soccer game, and this gave them very high senses of self, which can be a problem, but this is why they're so open and friendly and cooperative. The Zoomers are the children of Gen X, and we raised our kids knowing that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security would never be there for them, and we know that you can trust no one, and you have to be better than everyone, not better than the millennials, that's easy. And you have to put in the hours, and then you have to put in more hours, and you can't rely on anyone. So they are pathologically hard workers, and they're very loyal to their employers because they see their employers as giving them a lifeline. But they never want to meet you. Their dream job is to work in a closet that locks from the inside. So if you need coders, we've got a whole generation ready to go. But if you want anything else, you got to turn to the millennials. This is a cultural mix that can really work. I mean, there are negatives about every generation, there are positives about every generation, but at the age bracket we're in right now, we're going to have a highly productive financial sector. We're going to have rock bottom prices for IT because of the Zoomers. And in the middle, managing all the details, you've got people who actually like to be in the same room together. This works. Everywhere else, the boomers are leaving and there's no one else to pick up the baton.
Party structure that's a little bit more congealed, a little bit more firm, and that will give the Russians and other groups looking to launch propaganda efforts into the United States a lot less purchase. But we still have to get from here to there in an era when Facebook is literally marketing your data and Twitter has lost all content moderation. So I don't want to say this is going to get worse before it gets better, but we are definitely not out of the woods. It's possible, but it's a little messy and it's a little too early to know for sure. So part of the problem we saw with white workers specifically, they're far more likely to be unionized. And it's the unions that have really gotten hurt the most by globalization, because ultimately globalization was about finding the lowest cost and or most efficient producers. And in non-high skill industries, that was typically not union. So if you're working for Airbus as part of a union, maybe you are high skill and you can compete with everyone. If you're sewing underwear in Kentucky, probably not. And so it's really skill based. And if your job is protected not because you're good at it, but because you have a bunch of other workers working with you, then those are the folks that got hit hard. Now, yes, manufacturing in the United States actually never dipped in terms of total output, both absolute and relative terms. It went up during globalization, but it became a lot more focused on those high-end jobs with the high value add. And the low-end jobs, those are the ones we lost, whether to Mexico or China or anywhere else. When those jobs come back, they will generate a lot of high-paying jobs, not low-paying ones, because we now have had 30 years of technological advancement that improves what we can do. So I think textiles is the great example. Textiles was driven out of business because of NAFTA, and then it went out of Mexico into China because of the WTO. And so people who grew up in those families, had those jobs, they're never going to trust globalization. It's hard to argue with them. But now that it's coming back, it looks very different. This is not sewing seams. You can have one software engineer and one mechanic, and they can maintain a 2-acre facility that can make finished clothes faster and cheaper than 150 Bangladeshi seamstresses. Now, if you get one of those two jobs, great, you're pulling down 6 figures making textiles. But it takes so many fewer people than it used to. So in order for these people to appreciate what's happening as things renationalize and reshore, massive retraining is going to be required. Now, we are in a labor shortage, so there's a lot of business efforts going into retraining, but they're going to focus on the communities where they think things are going to work, and those communities already have to have a certain level of skilled labor in order to justify the investment in the first place. So if you're in a primarily rural area and there's not a significant population center near you, you're probably not going to make the cut unless you're willing to relocate. Because underclass implies you're doing a menial job to service people with higher skill set. These are people who are closer to being destitute because it's just difficult to imagine the sort of industry that was lost coming back in a way that benefits them at all. Now, if they can move into a different sector, and one of the things we learned with COVID is the technology has come a long way in terms of interpersonal communication, and you can do a lot of things remote. That's great, but that's probably not manufacturing. Well,
right, and there are lots of them, unfortunately.
We all say we love a merit-based system until we realize that 50% of the population is below average. And the United States doesn't have a good political answer to that simple fact.
Does anybody?
Yes. Now, in the United States, we look down on this, but if you are in most of Europe and if you're in Europe and you don't exactly have a great skill set and you're not particularly bright, there are still going to be networks of jobs that you can do. Also, most of the European countries don't have nearly as immigration friendly of a culture as the United States. And so you can't just import semi-skilled workers or unskilled workers from another country to do the unfashionable jobs. It's the locals who do them. That doesn't happen here.
Okay, yeah.
I remember when I lived in New Zealand in the 90s, the first time I saw a team of white people in orange jumpsuits doing industrial custodial work. I had never seen that before. Illiberalism digs in when people feel disconnected from their economic and social and political structure. Yeah. So it absolutely factors in. Now, the United States is in the midst of a labor shortage, which is one of the reasons that I think a more open immigration system would be good. I'm also not blind about this, and it has to happen in a legal way. We haven't had meaningful reform of the immigration system since 1987. It's time for Congress to pick this up again. And there's a lot of, I don't want to say easy fixes, but relatively quick ones. Now, what's going on at the border at the moment is Donald Trump had a series of policies, which included Title 42 as a COVID method, that allowed the federal government to basically kick people across the border back to Mexico. The problem with that is because it was based on health as opposed to status or legalities, they could just turn around and come right back in. And so we got this laundry machine churn at the border for the last 3 years. And when Biden came in, there were a lot of folks within the Democratic coalition who were relatively pro-immigration, primarily because Donald Trump was anti-immigration. And so when Biden inherited this problem, he ended up using most of the same tools that the Trump administration used. But because he was perceived as being less anti-migration, people just kept jumping into that laundry machine. So what is happening right now, the week of, it's May 12th when I'm saying this, is that the Biden administration has done away with Title 42 and put in a 2-pronged program. Now, this has only been in place for 2 days, so God knows if it's going to work. But step 1 is doing something we have not done since the 70s and sending staff down to Central America to run processing centers. The idea is you register with American Immigration before you even leave your country. And so if you've got a claim of prosecution or asylum, they can resolve that hopefully very quickly and have larger, more robust, more reliable means for legal migration. However, if you show up at the border without having first gone to the processing center, they've changed the definition of asylum so that 99% of people crossing the border automatically do not qualify. So, for example, if you start in Honduras and you pass through Guatemala and Mexico on your way there, you are automatically disqualified, because if you are going for asylum, that means you're scared to live at home and you crossed any international border on your way. Well, clearly you're lying.
And so they don't even have to look at your case. And if you do that, you cannot even apply at a processing center for the next 5 years. The goal is to end the laundry machine. Now, will this work? God knows. And there are other clauses in this that various folks across the country don't have problems with, so the legal challenges have already begun. But for the first time since Reagan, we're trying something new. The goal is to have enough staff there that within 12 to 24 hours you can give them a yes or a no. And by eliminating asylum as an option, almost no one is going to qualify. Now, like I said, this has only been in place for a couple of days, and there was a huge surge of people that came up in the last couple of weeks. There's a huge surge of people waiting, and they've all just pushed across. So in the short term, this isn't going to do jack.
Big boat. This is USS Ford. This is the most powerful military asset humanity has ever built. By itself, the Ford can take on any but the top 7 air forces on the planet. That assumes that the U.S. Navy fights fair. The U.S. Navy never fights fair. The whole point of a Navy is that the ships move. You get to choose the time and place of the fight. So really, one of these can take out any but the top 3 air forces in the world, one of which is the United States'. We're building 4 of them. They will then complement our pre-existing 10 Nimitz-class supercarriers, none of which we plan to decommission. 14 supercarriers. You want to knock off a country, this is the tool for the job. You want to patrol the global oceans so that commerce can flow unimpeded and without risk? This is a horrible choice because you can only be in 14 places at once. You need these destroyers. You need at least 800 of them. We have 70, half of which are dedicated to protecting the carriers. We no longer have a military structure that is capable of protecting global commerce. So the question is, where would we focus our efforts if we need to? Simple population density map by province. If you're in the quadrant that's in the top left, the bottom left, or the bottom right, your part of the world is a net exporter of energy, of food, and of industrial inputs. Only the top right quadrant is a net importer. In fact, it's just this circle. Anyone notice a country in there that sometimes we're a little nervous about? The country most dependent upon globalization and the American-led structures that allow global commerce is the People's Republic of China. And if we get to a point where we have to make some decisions about whose trade to protect, who do you think is going to be at the bottom of the list versus the top? China is the most vulnerable economy in the world right now, next to Ukraine. All right, let's talk about some bigger issues. Back in 2014, a narrative took hold that fossil fuels were done. That if by 2040 our goal is just not using them at all, then you got to look at your balance sheets and think of what you're planning for. It takes 3 to 8 years for you to get first oil or natural gas from a conventional project, and then another 5 to 15 years to break even. Well, that's already past the 2035, 2040 timeframe. You'll never get your money back, so why would you put your money in the first place? Now, there's a number of logic errors on that particular freight train, but it took hold, and we got something called environmental and social governance, among other things. And we saw total investment, which this is total investment from all government and all private sources into all oil and all natural gas. We saw it drop by 2/3 in 7 years. 3 to 8 years from the time you put the money down that you get your first output. Remember that. Now, what is true for the average is not necessarily true for each individual piece, thank God. This is my favorite graphic sequence. I think I might have showed this to you guys back in 2013. It's been updated. This is what I like to call the checkbook map. Every dot there is someone who can pay their power bill. And here are the world's conventional oil and natural gas production zones. Watch North America, because here's where the commercial shale zones are. That's it. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've systematically removed other potential candidates from the market. Either they're not petroleum dense enough, or they're too deep, or they're too spread out, or too technically difficult. There's just very, very few of them, except for here. Now, there's a dozen reasons why American shale petroleum is fundamentally different from everybody else's, but I think this is the most important one. We produce our energy where we live. We don't have supply lines that wrap halfway around the world.
So we don't need a global spanning navy to keep the lights on here. But everyone else does, and no one else has a navy. Yes, the Chinese technically have 600 ships to our 300, but most of those ships would fit in this room. Not all together, one at a time. Don't be crazy. They only have a range of about 1,000 miles. All of our vessels are fully deep water capable. In fact, that 1,000 miles assumes that they're going in a straight line and no one's shooting at them, so they can go slow. In combat situations, you're talking less than 400 miles. There's no contest. There's not even a hint of a contest. Checkbook map again. This is the upper Midwest. This is the most critical, important city in the history of Western civilization. It's Marshalltown, Iowa. It's where I'm from. This is Bismarck, North Dakota. And if you're there, you got to ask yourself, why? And this is not a frat party. It's lit up because of a problem with transport. Oil is a liquid. It conforms to the shape of its container. You can put it into a rail car or a tanker or whatever. But natural gas disperses. And if you can't gobble it up into your gathering network at the pace that you produce it, you have to flare it. You can see that from space. It's the same in the Permian. It's the same in the Eagleford. Which means in the United States, and only in the United States, natural gas has been priced as a waste product. And that means we have changed how we use it. Over the last 12 years since the shale revolutions first hit the gas space, well, 16 years now, really, we have seen natural gas usage and power generation expand by over 70%. We have changed our entire petrochemical system to, instead of running on oil, run on natural gas wherever possible. Our overall use of the stuff has increased by half since 2004, but it took a while. Here's pricing. Here's Henry Hub, natural gas pricing in the United States. These three spikes, you guys in the South, of course, know what these are. These are hurricanes. But by 2009, click, half of the natural gas that we produce in the United States came from shale, and every single shale well is onshore. So the energy sector became more and more inured to what happened elsewhere. And you can see for the next decade and so, we had prices below $4. Cheapest in the world, cheapest in history. Texans know what this spike is. This is what happened last January when Texas got cold. It got down to 27. Texans don't know how to deal with cold. Every system that they had failed, every single one. And then this is what we're all bitching about right now. We're at 9, which sounds just insane after being below 4 for almost 15 years. But 9 is right at the 50-year average. So we're bitching about average energy prices. You guys want to see what the Europeans and the Asians are struggling with? The marginal supplier sets the price. We haven't actually, until yesterday, had the infrastructure be taken offline. We are at the beginning of not a winter of discontent in Europe and China. We are at the end of the line. Europe was in recession a month ago because of energy prices. China would have been in recession because of energy prices, but it was already in recession because of COVID policy. One of the fun things about monetary policy, interest rates, is that you use interest rates to regulate credit availability in order to regulate demand. But as you'll see here in just a minute, there isn't a lot of demand left in Europe or China. They can never raise rates again. There is only one horse left drawing this carriage. And we now have elected the 3 most populous presidents in a row. We're done managing the global economy. And in a quick logic chain threading from geography to population patterns to transport needs to debt markets, you now understand how Mexico's regular bouts of debt crisis are both endemic and inevitable. And then there is its government. Meaningful central authority has a prerequisite: the ability to reach all portions of the territory. Not only is that far from a given in Mexico, but much of what transport infrastructure exists is beholden to the needs of the oligarchs. Its use is not automatically available to the government. Making matters worse, the oligarchs have tended to develop the most useful patches of land. In Mexico's too dry mountainous north or its too wet mountainous south, there is little of economic interest and thus little oligarch activity and little infrastructure. Upwards of half of Mexican territory, concentrated in the far north and far south, exists in a sort of Hobbesian limbo, where anyone who wishes to exert sufficient resources can make his will a temporary reality. Mexico's borderlands are zones so lightly populated that local authorities cannot police them, and they have so little infrastructure that national authorities cannot reach them on a meaningful timescale. Even in periods of plenty, these areas will always be insufficiently patrolled, and so will always be smuggling zones, and can never be secured in the way that Americans define the term. In essence, Mexico lacks the geographic characteristics to be a successful state. Geography condemns it to be home to a poor, drastically unequal, underdeveloped society riven by regional and class-based cleavages that no degree of local investment or understanding can ever heal. The only other significant country in the world that was dealt as bad a geographic hand as Mexico is perhaps Afghanistan. If not for a few lucky oil discoveries around 1900, Mexico would have likely faded into oblivion long ago. But as wretched as Mexico seems from time to time, no serious observer would say that it is even remotely as bad as Afghanistan. The reason for that is quite simple. It is next to the United States, the global consuming superpower. Somewhat ironically, Mexico's weakness has become the key factor in ensuring its success. The sheer difference between the two countries' topographies, America's capital richness versus Mexico's capital poverty, America's ease of development versus Mexico's constant struggle, ensures that Mexican labor will always be both cheap and underutilized, making Mexican labor perennially attractive to anyone wanting to service America's nearly bottomless demand. In that differential lies the core of Mexico's economic success. In the next couple of decades, a shift of circumstances will turn Mexico from the United States' extremely junior partner to something significantly more. 4 factors are at work. 1. Chinese labor costs have skyrocketed. No country lost out to China's emergence onto the international scene as much as Mexico. Prior to China's joining the WTO in 2001, Mexico was the primary source of textiles and low-end manufactured goods to the United States. Despite China's many internal weaknesses, its ability to subsidize its inputs and outputs and marry them to low-cost labor in an environment of centralized political control allowed it to undercut countries like Mexico that relied on mid-cost labor and proximity. But those days are over. Leaving aside the issues of China's political stability, or lack thereof, ability to continue subsidizing its output, or lack thereof, and ability to manipulate the international economic system, or lack thereof, it has simply run out of cheap labor. Since 2002, Chinese labor has increased in cost by a factor of 6 to about $3 per hour. In relative terms, Chinese labor has increased from being 1/4 as expensive as Mexican labor to 1/4 more expensive. Considering that Mexico already has far superior transport access to the United States, and that there is a decades-old tradition of collaboration between American management and Mexican oligarchs, the numbers certainly are positioned for a labor cost-driven onshoring to Mexico. 2. American shale is supercharging the Mexican electricity system. Due to shale, the Americans have a massive glut in their natural gas system. Unlike crude oil, natural gas is, well, a gas, and the transportation of gases is difficult. There are only 2 means of getting it out of a supersaturated market. The first is to cool it into a liquid about -260 degrees Fahrenheit, and then ship it to someone who has the infrastructure capacity to safely return it to gaseous form. This liquefied natural gas, LNG, process is the only way to ship the stuff across an ocean. However, there are also many regulatory steps involved, and as recent energy politics in the United States have amply demonstrated, gaining national approval for a transnational energy infrastructure project is somewhat difficult, not to mention that freezing natural gas into liquid form is as expensive as it sounds. While dozens of projects have applied for regulatory approval, only a small handful have achieved the necessary permits at the local, state, and national levels, and construction has only begun on one. Cheniere's Sabine Pass facility began construction in 2013 and is expected to begin operations in 2016. That leaves a lot of shale natural gas stranded in the American interior, practically begging for a market. But one of the great open secrets of the American energy complex is that it is already legal to export natural gas so long as it is by pipe and so long as it goes to Mexico. As of the beginning of the shale boom, there were already 9 natural gas pipelines crossing the border, supplying Mexico with nearly 1/4 of its natural gas needs, about 1 billion cubic feet per day, BCFD. Since the shale boom, however, work has begun on 3 major corridors as well as expansions throughout the export system in order to marry the ultra-cheap American natural gas to the Mexican power network and labor market. Exports doubled to 2 BCFD between 2010 and 2013, but the real growth will come in 2016. At that point, several new trunk lines will begin operation, allowing the export of U.S. energy to heretofore unreached Mexican regions up to and including the Mexico City core. Mexican imports from the United States are expected to hit 10 times their 2010 levels. Nearly all of that natural gas is planned to be used for electricity generation. Chinese competition aside, the biggest hurdle that has faced Mexican industry in recent years is reliable power supplies. The surge in shale gas into Mexico has already greatly mitigated that problem, and within a very few short years, Mexico's chronic rolling power outages will be a thing of the past. For manufacturers, whether Mexican or American, that removes one of Mexico's chronic limitations on industrial development. 3. Mexican demography generates a large market and a larger labor pool. Mexico also has a young population. Normally, this would be somewhat of a problem for a country at Mexico's stage of development. A capital-shy demographic combined with a capital-shy geography could forever trap Mexico in underdevelopment. In fact, that has been the trap Mexico has lived in ever since independence. But the positive aspects of a young population still apply. Mexico's young adults are hungry for goods and property. They just need paychecks. Luckily, their large number proportional to the overall population keeps their labor costs low and keeps foreign entities eager to invest in Mexico for goods production. While those investors may have initially been interested in selling those goods into the American market, there is every reason to service the local population as well. Doubly so since Mexico's lack of ability to self-industrialize means that internal goods supplies are so limited. In the early years, the Americans took brutal advantage of this with the Santa Fe Trail. American manufacturers were shipped to Santa Fe, a Mexican city, in order to build economic dependency upon the United States throughout the areas we now think of as the American Southwest. At the time the Americans founded the trail, Mexico was still an imperial Spanish territory. When the Mexican-American War occurred just 35 years later, most of the sparsely populated territory.
Let's start with the war. I'm going to give you a lot to work on here with oil and gas and wind and solar and transmission, but it all really comes down to the breakdown of the support structures that make everything else possible. That's what you're going to be wrestling with. What you've got on the right here is a population density map of the Russian space. North is to the right, so if you tilt your head, that's fine. That orange V going from Central Europe into Central Siberia, that's where everybody lives. If you go to the left map, same zone, but now instead of population density, it's an economic and climate map. And on that left map, the green is the Russian wheat belt. That's where you live if you live in Russia. The weather is atrocious. You get about 20 hours of sunlight for the entire month of December based on where you are. Cold, low productivity per acre. And when you don't get a lot of income from a wide swath of territory, infrastructure is impossible to build. So Russia, even today, does not have a national road network. You want to move stuff? It's rail or nothing. If you go to the right, to the blue, to the north, that's Tundra and Tagai. Nobody lives there. You go to the left, to the yellow, to the south, that's desert. No one lives there. Now, when Russians look at this, they get really depressed. Not so much by the blue or the yellow or the green, but the beige. Territories that are not economically viable, but aren't really barriers either. Territories where it's really easy to shove a Panzer division or a Mongol horde through. And since they're not mobile within their own territories, what has happened 50-odd times in their history is someone has crossed the beige into the green and they just rampage until Russia's weather defeats them. That's the typical Russian story. So what the Russians have always tried to do is to push out of the green, past the beige, until they can reach these geographic blocking points. The Carpathian Mountains, the Alma-Ata Mountains, the deserts of the Karakum. If they can do that, geography helps with their defense, a forward defense. And then they forward station static troops, because they're not mobile, in the access points between those barriers. 50-odd invasions, all of them have come through one of these access points. Now, today, the Russians are a little depressed because at the Soviet height, they controlled all those access points. When the Soviet system collapsed, they only controlled one. And everything that Putin has done in the last 22 years in his foreign policy has been about rebuilding those military footprints in those blue arcs. This is the Crimea War, the Georgia War, the Nagorno War, the Kazakh intervention. Ukraine is just unfortunate to be on the path to 2 of those access points. So it's not that the Russians won't stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that the Russians won't stop when they have all of Ukraine. We're only in like stage 4 or 5 of a 9-part plan here. Where are my Texans? It's not as big as you think. Just the scale of what the Russians are attempting here boggles the mind. I mean, from their core populations around Moscow, they've got to cross 2 Texans to get to where they need to go. It's big. Okay, here's where we are right now. The deep red are the territories the Russians controlled on the first day of the war. These are territories they grabbed back in the Donbass War of 2014. The pinkish areas are the territories they controlled on the first of this month. As you may have noticed, a lot of crap's gone down in the last few weeks. Now, the original Ukrainian plan was to move on these 2 bridges. These are the only 2 bridges that connect that sliver. Can I point this? Yeah, there. Oh, never mind. I'll just go point. The 2 bridges are the only parts of infrastructure that connect southern Ukraine to this chunk of occupied territory west of the Dnieper River. Only those 2. And so what the Ukrainians have been doing is thinking that if they damage those bridges so they can't be used for heavy equipment, which they've done, then any Russian troops north of them are going to be fighting on their own. Difficult to reinforce, difficult to evacuate. So they advertised for 2.5 months that this was imminent. And the Russians moved about 20,000 troops from other parts of the front to this zone, knowing that they were going to need more bodies and pre-positioned equipment in order to fight off that assault. That assault started 2 weeks ago. What the Ukrainians then did is looked at where the Russians pulled their troops from over here in the east and hit that hard. And that's where the front collapsed. That's Kharkiv province. And everything between those 2 areas is now back in Ukrainian hands. Now, let me give you a little bit of the backstory for the war to this point so you can understand the significance of this and what it means moving forward. You guys remember the assault on Kiev in the first week of the war when there was that 40-mile long convoy of forces? You guys remember how on the 3rd day of the war the convoy stalled out because they forgot fuel? And on the 7th day, all the soldiers dismounted and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. Now, everyone took their own lessons from this. The NATO lesson was that the Russians are incapable of fighting a modern combined war conflict. They are incompetent at operating above a post-World War II level of technology. Which means if we have a direct NATO-Russia fight, they'll be obliterated. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential survival. So all tools are on the table. So if the Russians do succeed in conquering Ukraine, they will then come for Romania, Poland, and the rest, NATO allies, and nukes will be their only option. So NATO is sending every possible weapon system that we can to the Ukrainians that they can use as fast as they can learn to use them, because we have to kill the Russian war machine in Ukraine. This is where Russia's future is decided. This is where NATO's future is decided, in Ukraine. We can't have a direct fight. It's got to be the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians and the Russians took different lessons. The Ukrainians had a national consolidation around the defeat at Kiev and have been kicking some serious since. The Russians now realize that their propaganda was just that, propaganda, and the Ukrainians are never going to welcome them in. And if the Ukrainians are not wayward Russians who are going to come back into the fold, they are the enemy. And so the policy of genocide started. And the Russians began advancing slowly, no more than a mile a day, behind an unfaltering wave of artillery bombardment. And in 2 months, they fired over 2.5 million shells, which is about how many were fired in a year in World War II. The goal is simple. Target every single piece of civilian infrastructure you see to make the land uninhabitable. And that way the population self-selects into 2 groups. Group 1 runs. They become refugees. You never have to worry about them again. Group 2 are fighters, and you can kill them on sight. So once the army moves forward, the Wagner group, the mercenaries, and the Chechen forces come in and just cleanse the area. We don't have firm numbers because very little of the territory even now has been liberated, but best guess is about 250,000 Ukrainians have been kidnapped and taken to Siberia, mostly children, and at least that many, again, have been killed. Again, we just don't know. We do know from German radio intercepts that the atrocities that were uncovered at Bucha after the Kiev withdrawal and at Izmain after the Kharkiv withdrawal are only 2 of about 90 examples of what has happened in occupied territories so far. It's gotten to the point that the United Nations and various NGOs have literally run out of staff to investigate the war crimes that they've already found in just the first week after the liberation in Izmain. The Russians are not making any effort to hide it. Okay, that's where we are right now.